Perfect. Okay. Thanks to y'all for coming today. And thanks for the really kind introduction. You had me very early on in my career at UCSD. So I should stay in front of the camera. Yeah. Okay. I got here, I moved to San Diego in 2018. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background as we get started. But for those of you who have never heard of the last lecture series, the first thing I want to tell you is that I am not Randy Pausch, but you should find out who Randy Pausch is and look up his last lecture. So universities across the country have made the last lecture series famous, a lot in part thanks to Randy Pausch's last lecture. And so he gave an incredible lecture that I re-listened to this past week and I've listened to many times since I first listened to it in 2008. And his last lecture, unfortunately, was his last lecture. He was dying of kidney cancer. He died 7 months after giving this lecture. And it is just an incredible, very inspiring lecture. So Google him, watch it on YouTube. I cannot and aspire to be as inspiring as he was at this point, but I'm hoping that I can at least share some of the lessons that I've learned on my journey so that you can either use that advice or figure out how what I'm talking about today fits into your own life. So to set some context, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about who I am, how I got here, just so you know the context in which I arrived at UC San Diego. And so I've lived my entire life in the United States, but I grew up and lived most of my life on the East Coast. So I grew up right outside West Philadelphia I could bike from my house to Center City, to University of Pennsylvania, to all of the places in West Philadelphia. And so I grew up in a town, but it's a town much bigger than many small cities in the US. So I went to a huge high school for the United States, had 4,000 students in it, and then proceeded to go to a very small liberal arts college, which had 2,400 total students. So very different high school versus college experience, very different from UCSD. Growing up, I had a really supportive family. I have been so lucky in that regard. And I have 2 loving parents. I have an older sister and a younger sister. They'll be discussed at some points in here. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do a lot of activities. If you've ever been in my class, know that I have a lot of energy, even if it's 8 a.m. in the morning. That started early on. I was a very active kid. My parents, I wasn't going to talk about this, but it came to my head just now, refer to my childhood, at least the early years, as me being a devil child. And they don't use that lightly. It took them a while to realize that I needed to be run around in circles so that I wouldn't have big outlashes and tell my mom I hated her and slam doors in her face. So I did some really terrible things as a kid, but I made up for it in my teenage years. I was a very easy teenager. And so they put me in lots of activities, and that was really great for me. I'm going to talk about how that lessons I've learned from that. But I did sports, I did music, I was in marching band, probably to the surprise of very few people. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. I went to a small liberal arts college called King's College. There is no reason you should have ever heard of that. If you have, you've probably heard of the one in London or the one in Canada. I went to the one in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The town, if Wilkes-Barre evokes something in your mind, that's what it is. It is blue collar, coal cracking town, kind of in the middle of nowhere. If you've ever watched The Office happens in Scranton. That's my Pennsylvania Scranton. You don't say the T in that word. Wilkes-Barre is near Scranton. That's how you can get some idea of what Wilkes-Barre is. So that's where I went to college. I studied biology and Spanish there. At King's, I played Division III volleyball and lacrosse. I'll talk a little bit about that. I went straight from undergrad to my PhD at Johns Hopkins. It's in human genetics. I spent almost a decade in Baltimore. Baltimore gets a really bad rap. I don't know if I'm dating myself now. I don't know if people are still watching The Wire. It's a really great show. But everybody thinks Baltimore is a terrible place because of it. And it's not. Baltimore is an awesome, vibrant city, has really great food and really great neighborhoods and people. I did both my PhD and my postdoc there. So I was there for 8 to 10 years. And it was great. And then I started my position here right out of my postdoc. So I finished my postdoc October 1, something like that. I know I arrived here on October 31st. because I will never forget, we had rented our condo sight unseen. We had like done a Facebook tour, FaceTime tour, not Facebook, FaceTime tour. And our landlord showed up with like cat whiskers on her face. And I was like, what have I gotten myself into? And then I remembered that it was Halloween. And so she had a costume on, she has kids, she was like going to their school, and it wound up being great. And it's been great since. I was an assistant teaching professor when I started. I was recently promoted to associate teaching professor at UCSD. And technically my main appointment is in cognitive science. I'm also 0%, we can talk about what that means if anybody wants, in HDSI. And I'll talk a little bit more about my role here in a second. But I wanted to give you all of that so you had some context of like where I'm coming from as I go through some life lessons that I've gained throughout. That said, I do have like a lecture-ish prepared in that like I have what I'm going to say in my brain. But if a question pops up or you want some follow-up or you want to like ask a question that you're not even sure you should ask because you think that it might be too personal, like feel free to ask it. If it's too personal, I'll just not answer it. But I'm an open book. Like I want this to be something that's helpful to you and worth your time. So feel free to interrupt me as things pop into your brain and we can chat about them. So I mentioned that I'm a teaching professor, and what that means for those of y'all who haven't really realized this, because like I didn't know these existed, and you could go through your entire undergraduate career not realizing that some people are teaching professors and some people are research professors, or even knowing that that's unique to the UC system. Like teaching professors don't exist at most schools. What I do here is mainly teach. I teach mostly undergraduate courses. No, I teach all undergraduate courses. Most of my courses are in data science topics. CogS 9, Intro to Data Science, CogS 108, Data Science and Practice, an elective that many data science students take. CogS 137, which is a newish course I'm teaching for the second time now, Practical Data Science in R. I've taught 2 capstones in HDSI, so 2 sections of the capstone, focused on genetics, because that's my background. I teach CogS 18, Intro to Python Programming, and theoretically at some point I'm going to teach this genetics course, which is CogS 169. It has twice been on my like what you're going to teach this year. The first time I had a baby, and so I was on leave, and therefore wasn't teaching it. The most recent was supposed to be this coming spring, but somebody dropped and they need to teach CogS 18, and I love teaching CogS 18, so I'm teaching that instead. So at some point I'm going to teach a course called Genes and the Brain, but who knows when that will be. That's the bulk of my work. The smaller circle is I do still do research, and I do a lot of mentoring and advising. So most of my research is collaborating with other academics. So people who have labs, have graduate students, have postdocs, which I do not as a teaching professor. They do experiments. They ask cool questions. I think their work's cool. They reach out to me and they're like, we have all this data. What do we do with it? And I say, oh, I can help with that. And so I've worked with a group in clinical toxicology here. That project has been analyzing data, understanding the effects of THC and related components around marijuana on driving, something we just don't know a ton about, and that states are setting laws about levels that people can have, and there's not science behind it, and we need science behind it. Anecdotally, all of the per se laws that states have set are too low, so people would be in trouble when they shouldn't be. Another project I've been working on recently is looking at how California's, because the laws are changing around what can and cannot be sold with regards to e-cigarettes and vaping products. I'm looking at compliance there and who's following the rules and who's not. So that's the project I'm working on now. I also, of course, advise my instructional staff, so my TAs and my IAs, and I do occasionally mentor undergraduates, but I have very limited capacity to do that because there's only so much time. And I teach a lot. Okay, so that's what I do. The plan for today is I have 10 life lessons. The slides are going to look a lot like this. I never get to have fun slide backgrounds, so I like really embrace that for this talk. And they're all going to be this like kind of wild drawing stuff because I can't do that in a normal class, and I wanted to do it today. And I was really excited to get asked about this talk because I keep lists for everything. I have like the lists app on my phone is my favorite thing. And I had a list of advice and lessons I've learned, just like in there that I've been keeping for, I don't know, 8 to 10 years. And when this group approached me about doing this, I was like, I can just turn that into a talk. I've been keeping this list of advice I've learned and things I've been told and that I've like incorporated into my life. And so I have 10 of them here, and I'm going to tell you a story and kind of how I got to the lesson. And hopefully some of the advice is helpful for you. Some of you, maybe you see yourself in it, or you see somebody else you know in it, or you have a question, and then I can answer that question. So I'm starting way back in preschool. And I mentioned briefly that I was the devil child. I was a very, if devil is the bad term, spirited would be the term somebody was using when, if you wanted to be nice about the kind of kid I was. I was very nervous around people I didn't know. I would hide behind my mom. I was very shy until I got comfortable. And when I was comfortable, you couldn't shut me up. I always wanted to be the one telling everybody what to do. If we had like a group of my cousins, I was the one like telling everybody the rules of the game that I had just made up. And so I, despite being the middle child, often like acted more like what people think the oldest is. You know, I was very bossy and told everybody what to do. And this came to a head. I have this very distinct memory. I don't know how real it is, but I have this very distinct memory of being in preschool, and we were drawing a mural. So murals exist all over the place, but murals are a thing in Philadelphia. If you ever visit Philadelphia, they have tours looking at these murals. They're beautiful. They're everywhere on every kind of topic. And so they have these huge paintings on the sides of buildings in Philadelphia. So we had this like long roll of paper, and everybody had crayons or whatever, and we were all drawing. And I was drawing houses, which is a great thing to put on a mural. And this kid, Matt, will never forget. I can like picture him. He had like super, super curly hair, which I thought was awesome. I always really wanted super curly hair. And he was obsessed with Thomas the Tank Engine. I knew him in preschool, but he was also through middle school. He was obsessed with Thomas the Tank Engine for a long time. It's a show. You don't need to know anything except it's a train. And this kid drew railroads through my houses, just like straight through what I was drawing on this mural. And so I let him have it. I told him that was not how the mural was to be drawn, and that he shouldn't be drawing on my stuff. And I just let him have it I'm like a little kid. And so I got in trouble for that. And the preschool teacher pulled me aside, and I got my first lecture that I can remember on not being bossy. Now, for those of you who are like told not to be too bossy, especially those of you who maybe are female, I'm going to come back to this and balance it out in just a little bit. But I was too bossy as a kid. And the reason you don't want to be too bossy is because people don't respond well to it. If you want people to listen to you, you don't yell at them. You don't scream at them. You don't tell them they can't draw railroads through your houses, even though they maybe shouldn't be drawing railroads through your houses. It's an art project. People have different interpretations of art. I get it. And so I got like my first lesson in effective communication and how to communicate with other people in a non-confrontational way that you can still address the issue at hand, right? Like I could have talked to him and first asked him like, hey, could you not draw them between, because this is how I'm feeling, right? There are a lot of ways I could have done other than yelling at my peer. And so I got first of what I will admit was a handful of being too bossy lessons as a child. And I like distinctly remember this to this day. So this is my first life lesson is you don't want to be too bossy, emphasizing the two, because sometimes you do have to be bossy. And I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so each of these is going to have a little bit of a story with it to add the context. This one was one of the most defining lessons of my childhood, and I think it probably applies to a lot of you. UCSD students are very smart people. You may sometimes not think you're that smart because you're surrounded by a ton of smart people. It's very common that I have students coming into my office, and they're like, well, all my friends already have 17 internships, and they have their job lined up, and they know exactly what they're going to do in the future. And I'm like, yeah, they're probably going to change what they want to do in the future. And like, it's great that they had 17 internships, but you're comparing yourself to other UCSD students, and you're around a whole bunch of really talented, really smart people. Like, you're going to be fine, breathe. You're going to find a job someday. It might not be the first job. It might not be your dream job, but you're going to be okay. And so that was a slight tangent. The reason I think it's going to apply to you is that I was a smart kid. Like, it is what it is. I was a big nerd. I loved school. If you choose a job that involves you coming and being a professor at a school, you probably love education and love school, which I do. And I always did. And I also had an older sister. And so I have a picture here. This is my older sister. And that's my mom. And I'm the one probably tired from being too bossy, laying on my mom. And I came home one day and I was in like first, second grade. And I came home and I was like, Mom, these kids don't even know how to do addition. They don't even know what math is, blah, 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 blah. And I had played school with my older sister because I was a big nerd. And like, I wanted to learn the things she already knew. She's 4 years older than I am. And we would play school all the time. And I loved it. And I knew something that a lot of my classmates didn't. And so I came home to my mom and bragged about this. And my mom gave me a very gentle but helpful lecture and said, Shannon, what's easy for you isn't going to be easy for everybody else. And there are going to be plenty of times in your life that what's easy for somebody else is not going to be easy for you. And this is one, I think, the most important lessons I learned early on was being able to put myself in the shoes of somebody else and like think about how they might be perceiving what I'm saying. And so if I go to school and I'm like, you don't even know how to do addition, right? Like that's not helping anybody. And it might make me feel better for like 3 seconds, but it's going to make that other person feel bad. And they're not going to be as willing to learn. And so this idea that just thinking what somebody else knows is cool and learning it from them and just admitting when you want to learn something and you don't have to show off what you know all the time, was a really important lesson. Now, little kids compare all the time, right? Like if you hear little kids argue, they're like, yeah, well, I had 17 dinners last night. And then somebody else is like, well, I had 30 dinners last night. I had 1,000, right? Like that's normal kid stuff. But I really appreciate that my mom instilled this in me early on, which also allowed me to see the flip side. If I had just pursued the things that I was best at, I would not be where I am right now. I was best at English and history and writing and languages, and I still like all of those. But what I liked the most was science and ultimately tech and data science. I didn't even know what that was. We'll get back to that. But if I had only pursued the like, I'm so good at this thing, I would have been on a completely different path and I wouldn't have pursued the thing that I was most interested in. So I appreciate my mom's lesson here for a whole bunch of reasons. Okay, we're gonna do, I think it's one more in my younger years and then we'll speed forward a little bit. Related to that is the power of humility and being humble. These first three kind of all go together. And here the mentor is my dad. So this is one of my softball teams. My dad's up at the top left. I am doing what, at least when I was in college, we called the sorority squat. I don't know if you still call it that, but I don't know why I'm the only one squatting in this picture, or nobody told me to just stand up and I'm not that tall. I've never been that tall. But there I am in my lovely t-shirt with my shirt over top of it. I was not stylish as a kid. I call it my character building years. I had really bad haircuts. Like I had a mullet for a really long time. For those who don't know what mullet is, it's business in the front. So I had like and then I had party in the back. I had this long hair. I had like squared out ears. And when I asked my mom why she did that to me, she's like, you liked it. That's what you asked for when we went there. And I was like, you were the mom. Why did you let me look like that? Anyway. So I had a lot of character building years, and this is one of them. It's a little obscured by the hat. But the point here is my dad was my softball coach, and he was a coach basically in like everything in life. But with softball, he would ask me a question. I was a pitcher, and so if you don't know about softball or baseball, like I was the person that threw the ball before somebody hit it, and so I was involved in every play, and there's a lot of strategy that goes into this. If you ask my dad also, I was the world's gift to softball. He thinks I was the best softball player that has ever existed, and I was not. He has like those dad rose-colored glasses. He was so disappointed when I didn't continue in high school, and I decided to play lacrosse, which he knew nothing about. So my dad thought I was like the world's best softball player, and I was not. But he took his job as Little League coach very seriously. He kept a book of very precise stats and then calculated them for every single player and would use them to like, anyway, it was not that competitive of a league, but he maybe this like stats, numbers, and the fact that my dad took a lot of data, there's a theme here. And so he would ask me questions, be like, why did you make this decision at this point in the game? And I would make something up and it would be mumbo jumbo. And he's like, what are you saying? And I was like, well, I did that pitch because and he's like, Shannon, you are not you don't know what you're talking about, right? Like you're just making things up. And I was so sure of myself and so afraid to say, I don't know, that I would just like make things up and blurt it out. And so my dad just over and over instilled in me, he was like, you can just say, I don't know. And then we can talk about it, right? If I ask you a question that you don't know the answer to, don't make up an answer. And so he taught me that in softball. And we would then have a lot of really great discussions about like, why did you make this decision? I would be like, I don't know why I did that. What should I have done? What do you think would have been better? Now, did we have a lot of arguments after games when he wanted to like question every pitch that I made? Sure. But he also told me that it's okay to say, I don't know. And this carried over into what my family refers to as debate hour. My family, okay, I have like a really wholesome background, a really great family. We would have Sunday breakfast together every week. And then we would have a family meeting after it. Like this is like some like TV show stuff. And the family meeting was just to get schedules together because we all had different activities. People had to be driven different places. And at some point during family meeting, my dad and I would get into it about some topic because my dad was constantly trying to engage me and my sisters in debate. And I thought I knew everything. And so I would debate him on all these topics that I didn't know stuff about. And he would do a great job, like engaging me and making sure I was like thinking through my thoughts. But he also would get to the point. He's like, you made that up. You made what you just set up. Just say, I don't know. And so being humble, saying you don't know when you don't know something is a really, really important life lesson. What's that?
So as I heard that kind of like sounds like metacognition, like knowing what you don't know or knowing what you know, they're gonna help you like come up with like your current understanding of yourself and find a way of development.
Yeah.
So I think that also kind of sounds like how science works also, right? So could you explain more about how that helped you to like develop yourself, and also for the research, do you think that was like what helped you for your research also?
Yeah. Okay. So I love the ideas in here. So it's for the recording, if you couldn't hear. So this idea that this sounds like metacognition, like you don't know what you don't know, and like knowing yourself and looking back and being like self-reflective. And how did that help me in life? And how did that help me or how did that guide in my research? Is that a good summary of your question? Did I miss anything? Okay. So I didn't know the concept of metacognition until I would say 8-ish years ago. I think I was in graduate school when I learned about it. And when I did, I was like, I feel like that's, I've incorporated that into my life, but it was not a conscious thing. It wasn't something that somebody had taught me that I should do with that term wrapped around it. That said, I think being self-reflective, knowing yourself, but also not beating yourself up when you realize you didn't know what you didn't know. So the reason I like teaching CogSci, for example, this intro to data science course, is the terms that are taught in that class. It's not a technically difficult course, but if somebody comes in without knowing what data science is, it allows them to get caught up because it teaches them what they don't know. Like you can't ask, what do I need to know about version control if you've never heard of version control before, right? Like it's not something you haven't thought of. So I think it's really great to be self-reflective and to think, what are the gaps in my knowledge? What do I think I know? What should I continue to know? But also don't beat yourself up when you like hear a word from your friends because they learned this thing in one of their classes or they had this internship and you've never even heard of that thing. And so I think doing your best to know what you don't know is great, but you can't know everything. I don't know everything. I get asked questions from students all the time that I don't know the answer to in the thing that I'm supposed to be teaching them. And so I find that when I was an undergraduate, I put too much pressure on myself to know everything. And now I'm just like, oh, that was cool. I didn't know that. Now I learned something. And it is that shift in mindset and that like growth mindset. I had never heard that term before either. When it comes to research, I would love to tell you I had some very clear picture on how I got into the research path I was in, but I didn't. It was a little bit of stumbling and like knowing what I liked and learning along the way. And I'm going to talk about that more. So I would say this, like, I would say it wasn't driven by metacognition and a lot of serendipity and luck, which isn't what you want to hear because you're like, one of a formula that's going to work, and I don't have one. Great question. Thank you. Other questions that have popped up in people's brains so far. Okay. We're going to speed forward. I don't have pictures for everything, but I have pictures for the things that I could come up with. This speeds forward to both middle school and then undergraduate. You're going to see the name Jeremiah Ori a lot. He has taught me so much. So he was my undergraduate mentor, research advisor. Mr. Davis would probably have no idea that I'm talking about him. I have not seen him since I was in 7th grade. He was my 7th grade science teacher. If I haven't painted a picture yet, I was a bit of an intense kid, which meant, and I also really liked school. I'm also a people pleaser, and I always wanted to like make my parents happy. And even though they like weren't putting pressure on me to do that, so I got to 7th grade, and let me back up. In 5th grade in Pennsylvania, we take these tests called the Iowa tests. Why they have a different state's name, I don't know. I don't know if other states take them, but they are standardized tests. And I started on my journey of doing terribly on every standardized test that I've ever taken. I started that in 5th grade. So I bombed the Iowa testing. I was a really great student. I was told I was really smart. And like, I still remember the percentiles that came back where I was in the like bottom 25th percentile of all these tests. And my mom says that I was sick when I took them. Maybe true. I also then proceeded to bomb every single standardized test since then. SATs, MCATs, GREs, all of them. I suck at them, whatever that means. I'm really bad at them. And so in 5th grade, I bombed these tests. And so in 6th grade, they started separating you out by like class level. And so there were teams in my middle school, and there was the Earth team, and they were the smartest. And I wasn't on that because I bombed these tests. And my mom had like thought about going to them and being like, hey, shouldn't, like, she's one of your best students, but she didn't. And I kind of support her in that, just letting it ride. So in 6th grade, I was not on the smart team. I was not on Earth. I was on lightning. And I was not pleased about that. And so I worked really hard in 6th grade so that in 7th grade, I could be on the smart team. And in 7th grade, I worked my way up to the smart team. They were all smart. The teams don't really matter. That's not the lesson here. Mr. Davis was my science teacher in 7th grade. So I was putting all this pressure to like prove how smart I was. And in his science class, I loved science. So I really wanted to do well. And all of a sudden I was not getting perfect scores on things. And he was like deducting points from my work, which was unacceptable as far as I was concerned. He was supposed to be giving me perfect scores like I had been getting in my other classes, and he was not. And so he had a parent teacher conference with my mom and my dad and was like, your child is going to have a stress panic attack, heart attack, something at a very early age because she is going to have a conniption because she cannot relax. And so Mr. Davis suggested that I should meditate. And I had only ever seen this in like cartoons. Nobody in my life meditated. I didn't really know what it meant. You can also, maybe I should paint a picture of Mr. Davis. He was very tall. He biked to work. He wore sandals. If you're picturing like a hippie vibe, he was definitely a little bit of a hippie. And so it makes sense that this was like a suggestion he gave to my mom. And he like kind of broke down the basics and was just like, she should relax and count and breathe, and like gave me a recipe. And I've been using that recipe ever since to meditate, to help me find some balance. I did not have a very balanced childhood of my own doing. Nobody was pressuring me into the things that I gave myself pressure for. And so Mr. Davis set me on this path of like, maybe you should breathe. Maybe you should take a step back. Maybe you don't need to try to do the best in everything you do and just like enjoy the ride a little bit. And I don't know who I would have become if I hadn't done that. I really started to relax and realize that like the grade I got on my 7th grade science test was not determinant of my entire future. And I didn't recognize that before. And more as I look back, I'm like, oh, that thing that felt like it really, really mattered a ton to my future, it didn't matter that much. And so gaining perspective and gaining balance has been really, really important to me. The way that I also think of balance now has a lot to do with this concept of yield and purity. How many people have taken a biochemistry class? Perfect. Nobody. Okay. So I was a biology major. Biochemistry lab specifically often has to do with, you get like this solution of stuff and you need to separate it out. Sometimes you're separating it out on the size of the components in there. And so like the little things will come through, but the big things stay back, or you're separating it out on polarity. And there's like a whole bunch of different columns, but like biochem lab involves pouring liquid into a column, turning a little thing and getting something out the bottom. And so you're separating stuff out. And in class, Dr. Ori, Jeremiah, I like still to this day cannot call him Jeremiah, even though he has requested since 2006 when I graduated to call him Jeremiah. He is Dr. Ori to me, and I can't not. Professor Ori, Dr. Ori, Jeremiah Ori, talked about this in class just as like a general biochemical principle, and that you have to make a decision between yield and purity. So you can either, as you're making the decision of when to stop this, you can either get a small quantity of very pure substance, or you can let it go a little longer and you'll get more out the bottom, but it'll be less pure. And this like concept of yield and purity just keeps coming up throughout my life. So like think about friends. You can have a whole lot of friends and not spend a ton of time with each of them. Or you can have a really pure group of friends that is like who you go to for everything. And I've had both at different points in my life, depending upon what I need. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I'm saying is that you often can't have both. And like knowing that there's this balance is important. What has brought me a lot of balance throughout my life are sports. So I mentioned this before. I, to this day, still play a ton of beach volleyball. At the top left is my beach volleyball partner from Baltimore, Skip. He is still one of my closest friends. And I've played softball. That's some grad school softball in the middle. I played flag football. And in college, I played lacrosse. And if you ask my mom at the end of any lacrosse game, she was like, Shannon, that girl was pushing you. That girl was all in your space. And I'm like, Mom, what game were you watching? Like, I was the bruiser. I'm the person in the red there. Like, I'm clearly trucking that girl in the white. And that's like what most of the pictures looked like. But my mom, every game, she was like, that girl was picking on you. And I'm like, okay, Mom. Like, no, that's not what happened. So lacrosse was one of my favorite sports. As I was growing up, I haven't played in years, and I'm not sure how it would go. But lacrosse is what I was recruited for in college. Volleyball is what I played because I love it. And I still play volleyball now once a week. Babies change things. I used to play 4 times a week. So now I play once. Okay. We're halfway through-ish. So number 5 was the power of being succinct. This is a lesson I am still learning and still working on, but I think there's a lot of power in it. So Dr. Ori, who I mentioned, he was my undergraduate advisor. I started doing research with him as a freshman, first year in my undergraduate studies, because he overheard me in genetics lab, which I was taking from him, say that I was interested in research and say that I like genetics, like things that would not happen at UCSD, right? Like you're not going to have a professor hear you in lab, say that you're interested in research, and then email you and be like, hey, would you like to join my research lab? Which is how it happened for me. And so I did, and we started this genetics project. So I had Dr. Ori for genetics, biochemistry, systems biology, a course on DNA, and a course on RNA. And so I had him a lot. I went to the small college. You have the same professors over and over again. And I did research with him. And I still had that little bug where I needed to like show him how smart I was. And so he would write these exams, and these were on paper. Probably been a little while since some of you did paper exams, and he would have like a little space for a short answer, and I would fill that short answer space, and then I would go onto the side, and then sometimes I'd go onto the back of the exam, putting like everything I knew. And I did this for a little while. I did this through biochemistry or through genetics, and then I got into biochemistry, and I wish I had the exam. I don't have it here, but I looked, and eventually he was like tired of my crap. He was tired of reading these answers that had the answer in there, and then like all of the things I knew on the topic also included. And he wrote a little note and was like, Shannon, I will not accept these answers any longer. Even if the right answer is in there, just write the answer. And I was like, okay. And so similarly, the first time I wrote a submission to be a poster session and my first manuscript, he like tore them apart. It was like this, too many words, red. You're not being succinct, right? Be clear and minimalistic. And that's helpful in writing. That's helpful in speech. Like just say what you need to say. I unfortunately fell in love with my words, and I would write things that I thought sounded great that took like 4 times as long as they needed to say. And I still do that to this day when I'm writing grants, when I'm writing papers. My first draft is way longer than it needs to be. And I go through honestly sentence by sentence or paragraph by paragraph. I'm like, what can be cut? Because there's always stuff to be cut. And so I'm still working on this, but I think it's a really important lesson both for verbal communication and written communication to think about how can I say what I need to say and nothing else. All right. This one I think is a big one, and one that especially those of you who are graduating soon are going to come up against. So I have been fortunate at a number of points in my career to have to make a decision between 2 things, both of which could be good. So for example, as I was leaving undergraduate, I really wanted to go to Cornell. I don't know why. I hate the cold. But I had this idea in my head, like that's where I wanted to go. And so I applied to Cornell and applied to a handful of other schools. I applied to a safety school, Lehigh University. They waitlisted me. And when I got waitlisted there, and I had no other options, I was like, I need to apply to somewhere that I'm definitely going to get into because I might not go to college. That would be bad because I really wanted to go. And so I applied to King's College on a whim. King's College is where my parents went and my parents met. And it wasn't like an academically rigorous school relative to all the other ones that I had applied to, but I was like, I'm pretty sure I'll get in there and I'll at least go to college. So ultimately, it came down to deciding between King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and University of Pennsylvania. And my parents were no help in making this decision. They said I needed to make this decision for myself. And I really, really struggled to make this decision. I ultimately, though, I am cheap amongst all other things. I have always been. And so I decided to go to King's College because I had a full academic ride there relative to University of Pennsylvania, where I would have had debt. And so I'm very happy about that decision now, but I don't know how I made that decision aside from being like, well, I don't want debt. There wasn't much else that I could decide on. When I was deciding on graduate school, I had applied to schools all over the country. I had interviewed. I had applied both MD, PhD, so for a joint degree with an MD, and straight PhD. I knew I wanted to do research, and I had interviewed a few places, so I had interviewed at University of Iowa and the Mayo Clinic for MD, PhD. I had interviewed at Berkeley and Hopkins and Pittsburgh and Penn, so a handful all over the country, forgetting some. And I ultimately came down to VCU in Virginia, Virginia Commonwealth University, or Johns Hopkins. Joseph Ayub was my advisor when I did a research experience for undergraduates, so an REU. If you haven't heard of them and you're interested in research, Google it. There are REU programs all over the place. They give you experience in a lab. If you're accepted into them, they pay you a little bit of money and you live with other people doing this for a summer. And so he was my advisor there. He was a postdoc at the time, and he had gone to Hopkins. And so he's the only reason I applied to Hopkins. I didn't want to go to Hopkins. I had heard horror stories. I had heard that people steal each other's research out of each other's drawers and try to ruin their careers. And so I didn't want that. But he had encouraged me. He's like, just apply, you'll see. And so I interviewed and I really loved it. And the decision was, should I go to Hopkins for the program or should I go to VCU where there's one person I really wanted to do research with? And so I made my pro-con list. I was trying to make this decision. And finally, Joe said to me, which decision will you regret not making? And I was like, I think I'll regret not going to Hopkins. I didn't know exactly what I wanted at that point in my career. If I had known that the direction of the research that other person was doing at VCU was exactly what I wanted to do, that probably would have been the thing that I would have regretted not doing. But I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do after graduate school. I know I love research. I know I love science. And so Joe said to me, what would you regret not doing? And when I have a close decision, this is what I've done since then, deciding where to do a postdoc. I made that decision with this okay, everything's kind of equal. If I think about which one will I regret not taking, and then I just do the one that I don't want to live with regret. And so could I have gone to Penn and had a really great career? Could I have gone to VCU and gotten a great PhD? But yeah, probably. I probably would have been okay if I had made any of these decisions, but I had to make a decision. And so I made one, and so far it's worked out pretty well. But I think thinking about this when you've already done all the pros and cons can be a helpful way to make a decision. All right. 7, this is a smaller in the story-wise one, but I think an important one. And I, growing up, hadn't thought a ton about the power of language. I hadn't thought about language all that much. And the way I thought about language was I took English classes and learned grammar. And I followed those rules because that's what you were supposed to do. And when I was applying for this job, so I had to write a teaching statement. So this is now, and you can see this is Ori again. So this is my undergraduate mentor. He's still my mentor to this day. I reached out to Dr. Ori and I said, can you read over my teaching statement and just give me feedback? I don't have a lot of people who could. And he did. And he gave me some really great feedback. One of which was, I just looked this up. He had commented on this, his or her, and he said to me, embrace the singular they or don't. I'm not your boss anymore, right? At this point, he's like, you do what you want. But I had been told, like, in writing, if you want to like refer to general person, you put his or her. And I had never thought about the singular they. I was like, you can't do that. That's like against the grammar rules. And so I was like, I looked it up and I was like, oh, the singular they is a thing. I was lied to in this grammar class. And I had never really thought about, first of all, how like non-inclusive his or her was, and also how awkward it is to read. Like they reads way better. This set me down a path of like, how many other mistakes have I made in my language? How many times have I not considered like who this is excluding? Like I have non-binary friends. Why did I not think the singular they worked in writing? And there are these things that are just like, okay, what can I think more about in my language? During CogSci, I think actually the quarter you took it, one of my TAs was like, Shannon, do you know how much you say you guys? And I was like, nope. Had no idea. And I really appreciate him telling me. I personally don't find you guys as a gender term, but a lot of people do. And it's really easy to just try not to say that and use like y'all, which I really like, which I also resisted for a long time because I am from the North and we don't say y'all. And then I moved to Baltimore and I was like, y'all is a great term. We should definitely use it more. And so I do. And having people point it out and thinking about this in my language and in the things I present in class. And so just realizing how influential language can be. I'm going to talk about a phrase in a little bit two phrases that were super powerful and affected like my trajectory and how I felt, especially in the moment. And so if like those words could have had a huge impact on me, what can I do to consider my language throughout? And so embrace the singular they. I had written out the slide before I went and looked for that image. And I was like, what if that's not what he said? But it is exactly what he said. He had said, embrace the singular they, and I remembered it. It's just like stuck in my mind. All right, questions before I delve into this one, or thoughts or comments? Okay, I think we're good. All right, so enter the first anti-mentor. It's like, dun, dun, dun. A very senior female academic when I was in graduate school. I was told that this very senior female academic did not like females. And I was like, that's absurd. Of course, she has no issue with females. And so my second year of graduate school, we take this class where each week is on a different topic. And you learn about that topic by reading a whole bunch of papers. And each week, one of the graduate students is the guides the discussion, and you present some stuff. And so everybody reads the papers, but you are like in charge that week. And when you're in charge that week, you meet with one of the PIs in our program, and they help guide your presentation. All right. So I intentionally was like, there is no way she hates females. Everybody's blowing this out of proportion. I like this topic. The topic was, people are going to be able to figure out who she is if I say this, but was exon activation, which is this specific thing that affects people who have XX chromosomes, so people who are biologically female at birth. And I was like, there's no way she studies that and hates females. And I think this topic's interesting, so I'm going to sign up and work with her. So I read the papers that she suggests I read. I read a whole bunch of other papers. I come up with a ton of ideas of what I want to present, how I want to present it. And we have this meeting in her office, and she hates all of my ideas, every single one of them. I present an idea and she's like, no, with that, no. And so I present another one. She's like, And I present another one. And then she says to me, and I quote, because I will never forget this, Shannon, I have worked with a lot of people in my career, and you are by far the most superficial person I have ever met. And I was like, excuse me? And she's like, she went like this, superficial. I was like, no, I don't know. I was like, I'm going to need you to explain. I don't know. She's like, you're not talking about anything in depth. Everything you're talking about is super shallow. And I'm thinking in my head, like, yeah, it's because you cut off all my ideas. Like, I can't talk about them in depth when you hate them. And so I took a breath and I said, this is not my thesis research. And you clearly have a way that you want this to be presented. Why don't you just tell me what you want and I will do that? This is not the hill I want to die on. And I don't know where that came from, because it came out of me and I was shocked that I said it. And then I went back to my lab and I cried, but I didn't cry in front of her. But like I had all this emotion built up because it was like really mean and it was not necessary. And so I go back and she told me how she wanted the presentation done. And I was like, fine, I'll just do it that way. It doesn't matter. This is a single class. And I don't know if she hates females, but she certainly did not like me there. And so I go back and I cry, and then I compose myself and I call my mom, because that's what you do. And my mom's an attorney. I didn't mention that in the beginning. And when she became an attorney, there weren't that many females becoming attorneys at that point. And my mom's just like, oh, I hate it when people make it hard for other people just because it was hard for them. And it was hard for this academic. Like when she was becoming a professor, it was really hard. She was one of the few, but like make it easier for the people after you. And so, like, for example, in graduate school, when I got there, the first years got to this like really stressful point in their first year. And at that same point, they were supposed to plan the events for the like incoming possible people during their interview weekend. It was just really stressful. It was really stressful when we did it. And so when I became a second year, I was like, why don't we change that? That sucked. And everybody's like, well, we had to do it, so should they. And I was like, that is a terrible argument, right? Like, just because it was hard, it doesn't mean you should keep making it hard. You should make it better. Okay, so that's one lesson that I didn't put in there, but I wanted to mention. So the power of your voice. Deciding when you want to speak up is really important. Sometimes you'll surprise yourself when you say it. I will note that this very senior female academic, after I did this, started introducing me as one of the brightest minds in the human genetics department and one of the stars of our program, which is baloney. I wasn't like one of the stars. I was fine. I did well. And so I was really glad that I spoke up then. But I'll also at the same time say that in graduate school, there will be people who want to argue everything. One of my closest friends, Joel, he would know, I mean, I gave him crap for this all the time. He would argue every point. It got to a point where I was like, Joel, I'm not going to debate whether restaurant X is better than restaurant B. Like, we're just going to pick one. Like, we don't need to go into a huge debate about this. So finding this balance again of using your voice when it matters and just like letting something slide. Like, I'm fine that I did the presentation the way she wanted it. It didn't matter that much. My ideas probably weren't that good, or maybe they were. It didn't matter. It wasn't the hill I wanted to die on, but I am glad I stuck up for myself when she was a meanie, which she was. I don't know if she's still there. I think she's emeritus now. Okay. The last two are not super long. This is a lesson that I did not start to learn or even think about how important it was until the end of my postdoc. So my postdoctoral mentor is Jeff Leake. He is a really brilliant biostatistician, and he's also a really great mentor and person. And so as I was applying to jobs, he was in, somebody came by his office at one point and asked him to do something. He said no. And then he's like, by the way, if somebody says it's good for your career and they offer no other reason to do it, run. Because that's what you say when you want somebody to do something that sucks. And so I was like, okay, that's good. And so I've tried to keep this in mind, and I have said yes to some things that are good for your career, but I've had to get a lot better at saying no. Because if not, you'll burn out. You won't be able to do all the things you've agreed to. And if you do, you won't do them well. And so finding strategies to say no and be better at it. Like, for example, Professor Walker, who most of y'all probably don't know, she and I are good friends. She's also in cognitive science. She and I have an email thread where we email each other to give credit to one another when we say no, because it's really hard for each of us. And so we were like, oh, that felt bad, but I'll email Drew and she'll make me feel better because I like added to my list of no. And so finding ways to say no if it's hard for you is really important, because you need to say no at certain times. The same time, Philip Go also, he doesn't know that he's one of my mentors, but he is. He had a really great blog when I was a graduate student talking about becoming an academic. And he's talked about the power of forcing functions. So yes, say no, but also when you want to do something, set it up so that you have to do it. So for example, like I wanted to give this lecture today, I would have never pulled this together if I didn't have to do it today. And so give yourself setup structures where you actually have to do the thing, right? Like for your classes where you've learned lots of stuff, could you have learned it all on the internet? Probably. Would you have done it if you didn't have the like forcing function of the class to get the grade, to get the degree? So sometimes forcing functions are how you get stuff done. And so set yourself up so that when you have a goal, you're able to accomplish it. Okay, I lied. I have one more. There's a bonus. And I think this is one of the most important. And so the power of honesty, obviously honesty matters, but being honest with yourself, and I think this gets back to your question a little bit, is I heard this stupid phrase at some point in my childhood. And the phrase is, those who do, do. Those who can't do, teach. And so I kept that in my mind. And I was like, well, I like research. I really like science. And so those who do, that can do, they do it. And so I was like, I'm going to do research. And I liked research. I wasn't running from research when I was leaving to become somebody who was more teaching focused. But also let me tell you that as an undergraduate, I played sports. I was going to mention that at some point more. So I played volleyball and lacrosse. It took up a lot of time. So I needed also to make money. And so I needed a job that I could have like flexible hours. And at a small liberal arts college, you can get one-on-one tutoring for free in any class. And they employ students to do it. And so that was my job. I tutored people and I loved it. I tutored general chemistry, biochemistry, organic chemistry. I tutored general biology. And probably other courses, but I tutored a ton. And that's how I made my money as an undergraduate. And I loved it. And a bunch of my tutees were like, you should teach. And I was like, no, I'm not going to teach. I'm going to do research. And then in graduate school, I sought out extra TA opportunities that I didn't need to do. And then as a postdoc, I enrolled in a pedagogy course. And then I signed up or applied to a job to teach in the summer that I didn't tell my boss about, but I was like, if I get it, maybe he'll let me do it. And all through that time, I was like, I'm going to do research. And like, wasn't honest with myself that I loved teaching. And so I did get that job to teach in the summer. And my boss thankfully let me do it. So I left for 3 weeks and I taught college level genetics to 14-year-olds, these gifted, really, really bright students through this program called CTY. I have a picture with all their faces, but I figured I shouldn't put that on a public program. So this is one where you can't see their faces. They were doing a task that I had set up for them. And it was grueling. I taught for 7.5 hours every day. And then there were no grades, but I had to give them feedback. So I graded their stuff every night to give back to them the next day. And this was for 3 weeks straight. And I mean, they learned all of college genetics in 3 weeks. It was wild. These are really, really bright kids. And I've never been more exhausted in my life, but I loved it. And I was finally honest with myself that like teaching is what I wanted to do. I came back to my advisor, Jeff Leake, and he was like, well, we need to get you more teaching experience, which we did. I taught some courses at Hopkins, applied for this job. And of course, I enjoy my job here. So be honest with yourself. Even if there's a little voice, like this gets back to the metacognition. Had I been a little more intentional, maybe I would have realized it a little sooner and gotten more training. Okay, so just to highlight, those are my parents. They're awesome. They've been my mentors throughout my entire life. That's me and Dr. Ori the day I graduated college. My mom hated that blonde hair. This is Joe Ayub. He and I have no pictures together, but we worked together for an entire summer every day. And he and I are still in communication to this day. I didn't talk about Don Arking at all. He is my PhD advisor, and it's only because I'm not talking about science today. He taught me everything I needed to know about programming. He let me join his lab when I had never written a line of code before. He was the reason that I got my PhD. He also told me about financial literacy, and he's the reason I have a Roth IRA. So you should definitely learn about financial literacy. He like one day broke it out because he realized that we didn't know anything, and did a whole lecture while we were in lab about like why we should save some money. And then here's Jeff Leake. He's the one on the left. The day he wore the same outfit as Andrew Jaffe. So of course I had to take a picture. These have been really great mentors. I talk to all of them still. Jeff has an email in my inbox. He and I are going to chat next week. And so I get yourself a good team of mentors, whether it's, family, friends, or academic mentors throughout. Okay. Number 12, power of thank you. Jeff Leake has told me to leave his name out of my presentations and take more credit for what I've done. And I think that's terrible advice. I think I should thank him all the time and put his name all over my stuff. And so I continue to do that, even though he's like, just take credit. You don't need to mention me. I still think I need to mention all these people. Okay, so with that, here's my why, which I'm going to leave you. This is my son, Caden. He's the cutest. He's 10 months old now, and he's walking all over the place. And these are notes that my husband leaves me typically at the beginning of quarters. This was the first lecture that I ever gave at UCSD. He has terrible handwriting, my husband. So he said, you're amazing. Now go and rock this shit. And so hopefully I have at least done that on some days. And then that's my husband over there. Probably, obviously, I didn't take a Christmas card picture with somebody who's not my husband and my kid. Okay. With that, thank you for listening. I'm happy to chat, answer questions. And hopefully we're okay. 2 minutes over, but we started a little late. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, what's up?
So you mentioned like a lot in your presentation. I had just a lot of energy, like spirited child is like one, and also just energy that's carried over. As someone who's like going to go to graduate school and is kind of concerned about, when I talk to people, the kind of loss of energy that occurs in graduate school, how did you sort of keep up that level of energy throughout your PhD?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So grad students love to talk about, in general, how much they work. Like people be like, well, I was there on the weekend. I was here, I spent 80 hours in lab last week. And I made it a conscious decision when I went to graduate school. I was like, I'm not going to engage in that. Yes. Did I have some long weeks? Sure. But I was never going to brag about it to somebody else. And I was going to make it a point to leave at a reasonable time. And the way I did it in grad school is I played a lot of volleyball. I found what balanced me. And so I played volleyball before lab some days, and I didn't go in until 10 or 10:30 because I had that flexibility in my schedule. I wound up with really great friends in my cohort, but then also made a bigger community in Baltimore. I had a great support system in Baltimore, and it was hard to leave. And so just being conscious of it, that like the thing you have to do and that everybody is talking about how much they work. I watched a lot of them. They were on Facebook. Like when you were working 90 hours a week, you spend 6 hours a day, like surfing the internet, which is fine. You can do that. But like to think that everybody is working all the time is just not true, even if they say they are. And so the way I did it was consciously be like, I'm going to try to keep it to about 40 hours a week, which I did most of the time. I'm going to leave it a reasonable time. I'm going to like cook dinner when I feel like it, and not like let those things go by the wayside, which I think too many people do. And then they burn themselves out in year 3, they're depressed. And, depression happens for lots of different reasons. But it didn't have to be that way. And so I would say, like, don't fall into the pit of comparing yourself to everybody else, because other people are lying. They're not working as much as they say they are. If they are, they're going to burn out. Or if work is the only thing or the thing that you really love the most, it's okay, but only if it's like internally what you want to do all the time. So that's my suggestion there. Yeah.
Mentioned a lot about your like how did you change like your transition from the bio like field.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But I just know behind.
That's a great question. Yeah. So the question is, how did I go from biology to programming? Okay. That was supposed to be in here, but I didn't mention it when I was going to. So the not too long story is Jeremiah Ori, my senior year of college, my last year of college, I had worked for months to get the data. And the data ended up being this like little glass slide that you take a picture of. And so the data is an image. And then I put this image through software and it ran some analysis and gave me some answers. And I was like, what just happened in there? And so I asked Dr. Ori, I was like, what did it do? Like it gave me out the answer, like the genes and the values, the difference. And I was like, I spent months getting these data. Like, how are you just going to analyze my data? And so he said to me, if you weren't about to graduate, I would teach you Python. And I said, okay. And then I went back to my dorm and Googled what Python was, because I didn't know you would program for any reason other than to make video games. I was not a gamer. I didn't like video games. I wasn't good at them. And so that was like my understanding of why you would write code. I had no concept that there are like other reasons. The idea that like software, nobody had ever suggested this to me. I went to a huge high school that had an APCS program. Nobody ever suggested I should do that. And so I just I thought it was just for people who want to make video games. I just was uninformed. And so I Googled what Python was, learned it was a programming language. And I was like, okay, I know I want to do research. When I go to graduate school, I'm going to learn about computational biology. And so, but I also knew I had to join a lab that somebody would like accept somebody who had never written a line of code before. Turns out I had written code when I was a kid. I played like MS-DOS Grover on my, anyway, I didn't know what it was back in Windows 3.1. Okay. And so I joined Don Arking's lab. I learned the first thing I wrote was in Perl, because that's what my boss knew. And I was like, well, if I got to ask questions, I'm going to go to him. And then from there, I learned R. And after that, I learned Python. And so I started doing large data analysis on genomic data sets. That's what my PhD was. Data science wasn't a term. It was like newly a term then. And so I was doing data science in the field of genetics. We just called it genomics. And so then I did my postdoc with Jeff Leake. He hired me to do large analysis of genomic data sets. He also had part of his group was doing data science education. And so halfway through my postdoc, I was like, hey, Jeff, that thing you hired me to do, I don't want to do that anymore. Can I do that other project? And he told me, which this is not normal, like don't hang your hat on this. He said, you have a year or two to do whatever you want. And he's like, and you have as much money as you want to do it. I was like, all right. I was like, Jeff, you know, you're not normal. Like, that's not a normal thing to say to somebody. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay. And so I built a program to teach data science to those who are typically left out of it. And so we built this program, made it free online, and then also did tutoring to individuals who had left high school, but had gone back to get their GED, so their high school equivalency. And then we're training them for the data science field. And so like, that's how I started to transition into data science education, but it's largely because I chose to do a postdoc with Jeff. Had I gone with the other postdoc, I would probably still be doing genetic analysis on the microbiome. Sorry, that was a long answer, but that's the answer. Yeah. Yeah, what's up?
You can say like a couple or like many of your lessons you told us is from like the result of going through some kind of like failure or like some kind of